So as we've discussed, just like in the BoJack pilot, the story is told through flashbacks up to a certain point. There are a few main threads to follow throughout the rest of the pilot. One is the conflict between Tony's garbage company and a rival. 2 is Tony's relationship with his mother and uncle. And 3 is the conflicts Carmela has with Tony and Meadow. Tony works in waste disposal, which is a job he actually performs, but is also a cover-up for the mafia work he's involved in. In the flashback right after where we last left off, the guys are discussing a problem that has come up in their business, which is that an opposing trash company has made a bid on a potential client against their own, which is unacceptable. Chris is offering to help engage in taking care of some of that business, which Tony allows. He asks him, "Are you over your stomach ache?" Not in a disingenuous way, but it does allude to the conflicting ideals of masculinity. Why is it that Chris wants to make excuses for putting off phone calls, but is the first in line when it comes to this? When we're first introduced to Tony's Uncle Junior, Tony pretends like he's about to shoot him, coming up from behind. Remember those scenes in Mean Girls where Katie plays out scenes of passive-aggressive conflict as if it were in the animal kingdom? Tony would be like a tiger taking down a pig. Sometimes finger guns are funny and a playful gesture between friends, but in this scenario, it's definitely scared Uncle Junior for a second. Tony definitely has repressed anger towards his elderly uncle, mainly for this reason.
When I was young, I told my girl cousins I would never be a varsity athlete, and frankly, that was a tremendous blow to my self-esteem.
That damn varsity athlete comment. Their relationship represents not just a conflict in age and time, but also with masculinity. The varsity athlete statement is pretty much a meme in the Sopranos fan base, but to be honest, this probably messed him up just as much as all the stuff from his mother did. It's one thing when someone is constantly verbally degrading you, but hearing it from someone else, especially people you personally like and respect, it makes it feel real, like the truth. Uncle Junior and Tony's mother pretty much become partners in misery. The modern elderly, which would be silent age and boomers, fall into a behavioral majority that can best be described overall as stubborn. This, like everything, has two sides. One is that we wouldn't have what we do if not for their stubbornness and will to live. The other is that they can be pretty impatient, and were too busy worrying about themselves for too long, with the American children barely being considered people in the past century. They almost have no idea what to do with the kid besides hit it or spoil it. Junior and Tony's mom are quite stubbornly stuck in their ways to a fault because that's how they've survived this world. Their problems don't come from the world changing, but from the rate at which it has changed. It's okay to not be able to keep up, but the majorative American attitude about competition has not really allowed for the time or patience from others it requires to keep everyone on the same page. And so we're introduced to Tony's mother, Livia, as a stressful, stressed out person. The reason Tony lies after locking the door, even though he simply forgot, secretly taking care of it before she notices, he knows perfectly well that she's going to criticize him if she sees that he didn't, even though he's more than willing to take care of the problem and willing to admit otherwise that he forgot. She is the definition of the victim mentality. Although her cautiousness is not the fault here, it's also like when SpongeBob decided to hole himself up in his house after experiencing a bad thing. She's aware that there is danger and is trying to take it seriously, but her reactions to it are causing problems for other people. She doesn't want to answer the phone after dark? Well, that's okay, but now no one can get a hold of you. She takes the gift from Tony almost as a threat, whereas he's being generous to his mother. And when she verbally cuts him off, she does a hand-slicing motion, waving him off, silencing him, rejecting him, and his opinion. She doesn't bother to explain anything to him, but just looks at him as if he's dumb, and then says he doesn't know what he's talking about. She shows favoritism towards his sisters, while simultaneously putting him down. One thing that is focused on is her calling Tony's dad a saint, but Tony states that while he was alive, she treated him very poorly. And even through all of that, Tony is worried about his mom, who he sees is getting older. He can see her dwindling, and since his dad passed away, he's worried about when his mom will too. The CD player is an item that's current at that time. He's trying to keep her in the present and have her get with the future in an attempt to preserve her. He's trying to tell her she can keep her old things but experience them in a new way. He's actually respectful of his mom enough to see her as a separate individual. But his mom doesn't want that, and she has never wanted that her whole life. She has always wanted other people to take care of her and let her do whatever she wanted to do, not be committed to anybody else. She had no real morals or desires of her own, just reacted to all the things around her. Her attitude is the portrait of a very specific type of silent age women. I would even say my great-grandmother was actually similar. Whereas on one hand, the person can be very generous, smart, intuitive, and even loving. On the other hand, they're very bitter, stubborn. She's the type of woman who, under different circumstances, could have been one of the forerunners of feminist movements at the time. She's the type of woman who could have had the power to change parts of her world, but instead let the worst parts of the world change her life. She's not just resentful, but threatening and violent towards her children, and effectively ruined her own family life. When she asks if she can feed Tony, he rejects it because he already ate. What he doesn't get is that this is also something that makes her upset. She's made herself so personally useless that the only things she can offer are taken personally when they're rejected if someone happened to have taken care of it themselves. Her entire resentful nature towards Tony and his father, seemingly men in general, is interpreted as her response to feeling rejected. As we'll see more of, Tony's mom is someone who is just abusive. We may have all been taught not to take emotional abuse as seriously as physical or other types of abuse. She engages in emotional abuse without realizing any of the consequences. She knows that something is off with her, but sincerely does not know what. She will never go to therapy. She will never talk to anybody about how she actually feels, besides what she may feel in the moment, either sad or betrayed. Those are all overlying feelings that is just the tip of the iceberg, because deep down in the core, she has unresolved trauma from her childhood. She has never been able to do what she thinks that she wanted to do. She just wanted to get away from her parents. She didn't want a family, but because she was told this is her life's role and she has to accept it, she's extremely controlling of her children and the people around her. And Tony just doesn't want to be controlled by her. And it's not even like it's a conscious effort to rebel against his mother. It's not a matter of him not wanting to be controlled at all. It's that his mother's judgment is horrible, biased, and selfish. She's only about herself, angry, resentful, and spiteful. Tony's relationship with his mom can be reflected and compared to Bojack's relationship with his mother. Tony's mom married his father to leave her house, had Tony and his sisters, and then treated the father like he was never good enough, no matter what he did. She never trusted anybody and truly only focused on her own misery, her own problems, and took her feelings out on others. Never satisfied, never happy, and always suspicious. And again, this is all coming from a place of trauma. It's a thing where this person knows that this isn't perhaps how she wants to handle things, but I don't think that humans realize how predisposed to falling into patterns we really are, even when our mind is screaming, don't do that. She takes everything Tony does as a slight against her, insecure enough to take him leaving for work as running off. She knows she's hurtful, she feels guilty for it, but also feels so comfortable in her own feelings that it will never be worth getting over. She doesn't know how to focus on happiness because she feels like the attention isn't on her anymore. She's an example of someone who expects good things to come to them because she feels like she's suffering. Reality didn't meet her childish expectations, and instead of divorcing Tony's father, which of course was not easy to do at the time, especially while being a young mother with no career, she was not encouraged to embrace true individuality. She never actually did put herself first. She tried to make herself be first in other people's lives. And that resulted on her taking out her feelings on everybody around her every time she felt bad, every time she decided that something didn't live up to her expectations. Tony doesn't storm out on her, though. He kisses her hand and reminds her about AJ's birthday party. Basically how I described Carmela's dedication to Tony in the first video is similar to how Tony feels about his mother's rejection. He reminds her and himself constantly that it's true how much he wants her around and involved and happy, but she she rejects him in favor of other things. She is not committed to having a child. And Tony trying to promote his mother's good health in the way that he thinks someone is healthy ultimately backfires because Livia does not come to AJ's birthday party. At AJ's birthday party, AJ tells Tony and Carmela that Livia is not coming, just started crying and hung up the phone. However, Tony may not remember it, as we the viewer know that Livia said she would only come if someone gave her a ride. Tony refused, and that opened up a whole grudge pack against him. She'll always find something to blame Tony for, so maybe Tony knows that it ultimately wouldn't have mattered if he drove her, but he is also misunderstood heavily by his mother, who thinks she's being treated poorly when Tony was trying to give her independence and keep her mind active in her old age. She takes that as abandonment, and the theme between her and Uncle Junior specifically is a fear of the future. Tony expresses concern for his mom since he doesn't understand that his denial of finding her a ride is the reason she's not coming, and feels hurt. Carmela, however, takes it as Livia trying to be manipulative. And she's not wrong, but Livia isn't aware of how dramatic she's being. Her emotional maturity is practically an infant's, maybe a teenager's, but one who's aware enough to be bitter and resentful each time they don't get what they want. She acts powerless and takes it as an insult and abuse when people don't treat her as such. On one hand, maybe she's always felt like that other people have high and unfair expectations from her that she's always tried to run from, knowing that she can't find a way to get up to those expectations. On the other hand, she knows what the expectations are and refuses to communicate directly about what can be done to actually meet the expectations. She's not willing to work. She's not willing to work with anybody. She's not willing to work on herself. Carmela and Livia can be compared in the way that they are two mob wives from different times. By allowing women more independence in more recent times, we've eliminated a lot of the feelings that Olivia has had to struggle through. That definitely isn't to say that nobody feels that way at all anymore, but Carmela has the freedom to be committed to things that she wants to be committed to. While they have a similar logic-based nature, Carmela is not fueled by her emotions the same way Livia is. Carmela is someone who is kind of fighting the line between being reactive towards things and logically trying to figure things out so she isn't reactive. While Tony is in the MRI, they have a fight, and she only lets herself touch him as he's going away into the machine. This seems important because it shows that Carmela does not want Tony to die. She doesn't want there to be leftover or hidden things in their marriage. By the time they both pass away, she wants their relationship to reflect what she sees in her head. But the both of them struggle with hang-ups that drive each other away from the other. Tony asks if she thinks he has a brain tumor. Carmela says they're going to find out. He doesn't take that as comforting. This shows that she is more of a logic-based personality where Tony desires sentiment. To an extent, he wants her to take the time for him. But that can't happen when people act too overprotective from themselves. Even though Carmela is logic-based, her reaction to what's going on is more based on herself than on him. It would have been selfless of her to slow down for a second and take the time to comfort him. It would have been the right thing to do. It's the way that she claims that she is aspiring to be. She's aspiring to be better, and with that, she must learn to become more patient. And not in the way of sitting, suffering, waiting for someone to just get it, but being proactive by being committed and engaged. She is worried about him and does love him, but a core trait that almost every person in these shows have is the inability to show love selflessly. Everyone around them is just expected to put up with what they got, and that immediately is a tension driver. Their fight is the result of that. Another poignant line here that we'll see the effects of is that Carmela tells him, "You're gonna go into hell when you die." Tony's struggle, and everyone else's really, is to find the balance between the life they have and the life they want, picking proverbial weeds out of the way. The weeds in this aspect are their respective affairs from each other. Tony's upset that Carmela talks to the priest, and wherever that may go, he doesn't want to admit that it's from his own shortcomings. He's ready to think that something is going on between the two, not just because he's the type of person to engage in an extramarital affair, but because through his own logic, he sees why she would want to. That's a trait that Tony definitely got from his mother. Ultimately, because he was raised by someone who reacts out of their own fears, he makes up his own fears, reacts to them, and ends up creating the reality of which he was afraid of in the first place. Getting into the crime aspect of the story, the mafia would use something called bid rigging to make money in the sanitation business. Each family controls a territory and has multiple cartels in those territories. When a regular business needs trash services, one cartel will offer their service at an extremely marked up price. The other cartels in that territory will then offer up their services at an even higher price, forcing the regular business to choose the least expensive of those. When other sanitation services, whether they're owned by a rival mafia family or not, try to offer a lower bid for the customer, the mafia would find out and take care of them, which is what's happening in this pilot episode. Tony's company is Barone Sanitation. The rival company they're dealing with is Kolar Bros Sanitation. Kolar Bros made a conflicting counterbid against Barone for the Triborough Towers, which needed to be dealt with. Christopher's excitement to take care of the trash situation versus his tummy ache excuse for not making a phone call strikes me as the result of his I need to be the hero mentality. Where he might be thinking work smarter, not harder, he's not doing that right, and is actually coming off more like he doesn't know how to measure progress. He's not being consistent in his work, which would mean that he would be taking care of tasks such as making phone calls the same way he would take care of the trash situation. That doesn't mean he has to be as enthusiastic, but it shows he doesn't understand that what he has wouldn't exist if his coworkers and the ones before him thought the little things could wait. If he truly was working smarter, he would figure out a way to make the phone call as short and effective as possible, not avoiding it like a coward. It just shows that he's not committed to maintaining the mafia so much as he is wanting to be a hero like his dad, or Tony's dad, or even Tony himself. This is reflected in the scene where Chris meets with Emile, the details of which Tony does not go into with Dr. Melfi, but we as the viewer are the only witnesses to Chris's crime. Chris invited Emile to meet him after hours at Satrial's, which is a pork shop that Tony owns, where Chris and Tony met up with the boys at earlier. Emile is the nephew of one of the bosses at Kolar. He isn't involved in any direct mafia activity, but benefits off of it, and habitually deals in hard drugs, which is how Chris got Emile to meet with him. Chris murders Emile the same way Tony pretended to when scaring his uncle. Directly after this scene, Tony refers to his uncle, and tells Melfi about problems with him. On this end of the crime scene, Uncle Junior is wanting to ambush an enemy, Little P. Malanga, at a restaurant that one of Tony's childhood friends owns. Tony knows that a mafia hit happening at his friend's restaurant would cause problems for his friend and his business, and is trying to convince his uncle to take the hit elsewhere. Uncle Junior gets upset with Tony trying to control him, aka being strategic and considerate, even though he ran someone over with a car in front of 100 people. That's a plot hole for another day, though. His uncle gets so upset that he says, "How many hours did I spend playing catch with you?" which stops Tony and seems to hurt his feelings, bringing up memories of the whole varsity athlete jab. I interpret that as Uncle Junior saying, "I did a bunch of stuff for you that I didn't like, you owe me for this." Melfi quickly changes the subject back to Tony's immediate family, and we see a short scene depicting Carmela and the priest watching a movie together and talking about Tony's taste in gangster films. Carmela hears someone jiggling a lock outside and produces a large gun to inspect what's happening. Turns out that AJ locked Meadow's window after she snuck out that night, effectively getting her in trouble. Carmela's punishment is denying Meadow the privilege of going to Aspen with her friend Hunter, which drives the wedge further in between Carmela and Meadow's relationship. Tony doesn't see the depth in between these rifts and says it will blow over, and although he's generally right, I think that he is not necessarily giving the attention, the credit it needs to have. I think that he just trusts Carmela will take care of things. Dr. Melfi responds by asking if Tony admitted to Dr. Cusimano that he was feeling depressed. She's asking him this in response to what he's saying because she knows that depression isn't something that will just blow over, and wants Tony to understand that what he just said contradicted his more long-term feelings. He sits silent for a while because he doesn't like the answer in his head, and changes the subject to Melfi's Italian heritage and asks her where her family is from. He flirts with her, and she doesn't respond, which ruins his attempt at keeping things lighthearted and not about himself. He got used to talking about other people and forgot he was there to talk about himself. So, this makes him feel embarrassed and leads to another important monologue in this episode, which is another supporting factor in my point about American masculinity, the Gary Cooper speech. Gary Cooper was an actor from Helena, Montana, the Texas Texas of northern U.S. He embodied the strong, silent cowboy aspect that Tony admires and sees as worthy qualities for a man to have. Tony thinks that people are too soft, which refers to Chris and others. Tony claims that Gary wasn't in touch with his feelings, he just did what he had to do. It's clear that Tony is projecting a lot onto this actor because Tony sees himself as the strong, silent type who does what he needs to do. But as he describes Gary Cooper, once he's in touch with his feelings, you wouldn't be able to shut him up. Tony is the one who is effectively running his mouth about his problems, which he again feels embarrassed about. He's reminded that he's there to run his mouth about himself and not the conflicts between his family and friends unless they're pertaining directly to his depressed feelings. He's mentally in the beginning stages of accepting the deeper connection between his depressed feelings and the conflicts around him, how he's handling them, and what the effect on his life they're really having. Things won't just blow over for him forever, and the physical toll it's taking on him may result in a heart attack. He's not making the connection that people who are able to do what they need to do are actually very in touch with their feelings. Otherwise, they wouldn't know what they need to do. What he's really upset about is having deep feelings that he doesn't understand. He doesn't understand that what he really wants is simplicity, and associates hope for the future and the ability to presently function with the ability to understand and act quickly. What people in the past had was only a vision in mind when they were working to make things simpler for us presently and what we work on for the future. When they invented washing machines and turned a days-long process into something that took a few hours, they knew they would be saving time, but they wouldn't have known what that meant. As chores and jobs took less time to do, people started figuring out ways to spend the extra time, filling it up with all types of different things. One of those things includes retrospection, reflecting on how things are and how things have gone in one's life. At this point in time, a lot of people have a lot of time to reflect on history, the present, and the future. For some people, it's easy to apply this method of thought onto themselves and their personal feelings. For others, like Tony Soprano, it's just something that frustrates them and hurts their self-esteem by not knowing good enough answers. Tony is someone who wouldn't believe in a mental illness if you tried to explain it to him as a dysfunction, because to him that means there's something wrong with potentially no fix, except going through more suffering and humiliation than necessary. He had been taught that the negative emotions that come with the conflict he's used to is simply part of his culture, and how he believes most people are raised, instead of realizing he could have a different type of control over these conflicts if he adjusted his reactions and had a goal. Tony can make plans short-term, but not so much long-term, and so this limited scope is part of what fuels his disconnection between emotional health, financial security, and personal safety. Tony storms out of Dr. Melfi's office because he's unable to talk about why the duck's leaving had triggered so much anxiety within him. Tony's associating the phrase, "do what needs to be done," in relation to work, but he's making the mistake of thinking that emotions shouldn't involve work. He doesn't get that he treats emotional labor the same way Christopher treats physical labor. He's mad that things aren't simple, but he's one of the influences in his life making things tougher. He wants to be the hero emotionally, making grand gestures and indulging himself in his personal vices, but he doesn't want to do the work to be the hero that the people who matter most to him need in their lives. Big P and Chris are getting rid of the evidence. This is where we can assume time lines up from the stories being told in flashbacks to being concurrent with the present day. Big P had to give Chris advice on where to place the evidence so to raise the least amount of suspicion. Christopher is bitter towards Tony about being mad about Chris's actions. So Chris becomes another person in the pilot who criticizes how Tony runs things, saying Tony is running it down and that he had to take things to this extreme as a result of Tony's poor skills. Ironically, Big P is one of the only characters that remains on Tony's side. It's pretty telling how when Big P is giving Chris advice and Chris quotes The Godfather incorrectly, it just further shows how naive he is when it's an otherwise serious setting. Big P has to explain to Chris how this isn't a movie and there are real consequences to risk. There's definitely a lot of reasons as to why mob activity died down once films were being made about it, and one of them is self-awareness. Chris is playing the ignorant yet confident kid, truly not understanding the serious nature of the business or his role in it, taking on large projects without knowing how to do them and relying on the person with more experience to help. Tony has his second panic attack, triggered by his mother throwing a tantrum over mistaking the retirement home they're being shown as a nursing home. This is the second time that an event is triggered after a character says the word die. This is also where we see how Meadow is upset at her mother. Tony's mom has such a need for control and such a fear of dying and being irrelevant that she unknowingly triggers Tony's need to maintain peace. to the point that his body is beginning to shut down on him. She refuses to take any personal responsibility for her problems, and outright blames Tony for things out of his control, while ignoring the stuff he takes care of within his control. She's a slave to impulse, and the benefits she reaps from the people around her, taking advantage of their concern and kindness, but with the only goal being to make them feel her suffering. She expects someone to save her from the misery she feels and perpetuates. She sees herself as such a victim that she doesn't get that someone taking care of her is the key of real freedom. She rebelled against her parents when she was younger by running off with Tony's dad, but resented him for not fixing her or letting her be free. He actually was in love with her, where she hadn't let herself feel safe and vulnerable enough to show love. When she got pregnant, she was even more resentful, and spread the resentment towards her children for being limitations towards her perceived freedom. So her mistaking the home for a nursing home, and reacting to it in the way that she does, is purely a result of this fantasy she has of freedom, and guilt for the way that she knows that she's treated people. She's a mirror of America in a more common and significant way than one may initially perceive. A majority of Americans are sociopaths, and she's on the far end of that spectrum as far as I'm concerned. She doesn't quite say psychopathy to me because the patterns of her patterns are a result of ways she's decided to live her life when she's had other options, as opposed to something she initially is. She doesn't seem to have a clear thought process or understand context or deeper meaning of things beyond a way to fuel her narrative. To me, there's a difference between a psychopath and someone who throws so many tantrums trying to get their way, otherwise acting like a toddler. She's not particularly intelligent or motivated. She has a negative mindset and becomes a catalyst for it, letting trouble happen where she sees it and looking for problems that never have an acceptable fix. A negative mindset isn't finding rational problems like noticing bad weather or a hole in someone's plan. A negative mindset is whining over having problems in general. Life not being perfect means sometimes your coffee is cold. Livia doesn't have control over the big problems in her life and never took initiative to get handle on herself. This is one of the best scenes in the series because Tony passing out is one of the only times she genuinely shuts up for a second. Then all of a sudden the nursing wing isn't so inconvenient, is it, Livia? As Tony has his second panic attack, we are led into the scene where Tony is seeing Dr. Melfi for the first time since walking out on their session before. Tony criticizes his mother for being two-faced and wearing down on his father, who Tony sees as a great man otherwise. Dr. Melfi asks Tony if he has a problem with the way that he makes a living. This leads into Tony literally having a Joker moment. He describes yet another societal issue in the framework of his world. He says that people are no longer down to take hits for the family and become informants too easily, betraying who they once called brothers. The way this happens in real life is by people being taught that self-sacrifice makes you foolish, feeding the form of individualism that's toxic. People who are not committed to anything can be swayed or bribed or have no faith in what they claim to be a part of. This doesn't make them bad people, but it doesn't make them loyal, and it means that they should be involved in something else. Nobody wants to suffer, but everyone wants to benefit. So when people like that are confronted with consequences but see a way to avoid them, other people end up suffering. To Tony, it doesn't make sense to want to be a gangster but be scared of spending time in jail. Pretending to be noble while committing the crimes is only something cops end up using as a reason to manipulate them while gaining information they wouldn't have otherwise. Would Robin Hood and Little John have squealed on each other in a second, or died together as brothers? Tony is prescribed Prozac, begrudgingly. The relationship between Americans and pills can be a whole video in itself, but this portion specifically speaks to the hesitancy many Americans have towards taking their medication. You either can't get them to take their pills, or you can't stop them from taking too much. This next scene comes full circle from the scene in the first 10 minutes. The guy Tony ran over still can't pay him back. Additionally, Uncle Junior still wants to whack Little P in Tony's friend's restaurant. An important piece of dialogue is shared between Tony and his associate. Tony is warned that his love for his uncle doesn't matter against the vengeful insecurity Uncle Junior holds. Uncle Junior does not love Tony the same way Tony loves him. Uncle Junior is jealous of Tony and insecure that he's not in charge. He's practically deciding to kill this man as a way to spite Tony's power and make himself feel like a big man again. It is a job that needs to be done, as Little P took Uncle Junior's share of a robbery they pulled, so it's not a completely unnecessary wiener wave, but Uncle Junior's commitment to ignoring Tony's reasons is. Tony's new quest becomes to get his friend out of town for a few weeks, so the restaurant will be closed at that time. Secondarily is the qualm of the debt that they are attempting to collect. Tony learns from his MRI and hospital visit that, well, it's expensive. So his solution is to have the man, Mahaffey, pose as an HMO and pay out on fake claims in fake clinics that Tony and his crew will set up. Tony poses this as a false choice to be presented to Mahaffey, because the other option is pay what he owes all at once, which he obviously can't do. Mahaffey is lucky Tony and his crew are keeping him alive. The only reason is because they want their money back. What Mahaffey and other poor unfortunate souls don't seem to get is that if you borrow from someone, you better pay back your dues quickly, because eventually the cost of chasing you outweighs the worth of keeping you alive, and you become a pest. This conversation also holds an iconic exchange of dialogue. Garbage is our bread and butter. Was. This is referring to exactly what Tony was talking about at the beginning of the episode. Another full circle moment. He feels like he is at the end of things. The garbage business was indeed lucrative, but by the end of the 90s, it simply wasn't. Christopher again shows his naive know-it-all enthusiasm by repeating a phrase he had heard from someone else, without understanding the current context. Chris doesn't see the difference because he was firstly too young to have experienced the same way Tony did, and secondly, benefits off the fruits of his elders' labors too habitually to understand that his elders did not have the same access in their youth. There's a timeline before Chris was born and introduced to the world that he is only slightly aware of. He's lucky enough to be born into something and doesn't have to use his youth up trying to understand and find his role in life. He still does have a life path, but he has guidance on it, where most today have very limited or non-personal guidance, if any at all. Chris is like a small, spoiled indoor dog, dancing and twisting and yapping for a treat, sulking when he doesn't get one, doesn't know how to fetch, but will always expect a treat. And he gets it, because what his elders used to see as a treat is now accepted as a necessity, like when cell phones were considered luxury items, but now are rightfully expected by the majority of people. Clean water used to be considered a rare luxury, even to the point of myth, but now it is rightfully expected. When garbage stops providing, what will replace it? Carmela and Meadow's personal conflict reaches a point where a fight happens. Their relationship is very important, and portrays a common relatable issue where although mother and daughter care for each other, they misunderstand each other and don't communicate directly with each other until it comes to this point. So the argument they have is pretty layered. On a surface level, you can see there are hurt feelings on both sides. There are truths underlying that neither party is willing to accept. There is a spectrum of outcomes that are all triggered by how effectively people communicate with and understand each other. There are controllable factors, and consequently, contextually, uncontrollable factors. The root of the issue is that when a kid is growing up, their role naturally creates conflicts with the guiding figure. While the child's job is to explore their freedoms in their environment, the guardian's job is to limit those freedoms, to be authoritative, and to control the environment. The child explores the freedoms, but the parent defines what freedom is. Carmela doesn't forbid Meadow from being friends with Hunter, even though she isn't fond of her. However, her taking away the trip that Hunter and Meadow have planned comes off as intentional. It could be taken like it wouldn't have mattered if Meadow behaved or not, because Carmela doesn't like Hunter. Carmela is doing the things some parents do where they take away a big privilege as punishment for doing something wrong. This can be effective in some cases and more so on a smaller scale, but I think that some parents need to accept at some point that the privileges being taken away are no longer privileges, but are instead necessary for them to develop further. On the surface, it comes off like Carmela is jealous of Meadow spending time with Hunter and expects Meadow to hang out with her now that she's canceled the trip. But whether she's jealous or not, as it's already been stated, she doesn't like Hunter. It's pretty apparent that Carmela isn't forbidding Meadow to go for any personal reason. She was rightfully upset that Meadow snuck out, and it goes against the deal that Meadow had promised. However, Meadow is right in saying that a trip like that with a friend will likely be her only chance. It is just unfortunate that Carmela put herself in a position of opposition with her daughter for that realization to come. If Carmela decided not to link the bad behavior of sneaking out with the harsh punishment of denying a core developmental memory, she could have instead started teaching Meadow of the importance of staying in when necessary, or at least letting someone know. Carmela does seem to accept that Meadow is growing up, but doesn't seem to understand that you can't punish a teenager the same way you can punish a small child. child. The parent needs to guide the child and communicate with them, and that requires paying attention to your child and altering your approach as they grow up. Meadow loves her parents, but understands she'll be in trouble, so if Carmela made it a safer and more trusting environment for Meadow, eliminating the trouble aspect, Carmela would potentially have more respect and positive response from her daughter. Meadow messed up, but she didn't lie, and effectively communicates her hurt feelings to her mother, which Carmela is not used to. But their relationship is wonderfully and realistically portrayed in the realm of what does it look like when two people love each other but don't understand each other and are still trying to make it work. Carmela is logic-based, again, but loses herself in trying to be a good parent, so that comes at the cost of something Meadow would have otherwise enjoyed doing with Carmela. Both of them have their feelings hurt, but a theme with the Soprano family is that the kids feel things and try to make sense of the emotions their parents try to avoid. They can't deny that their emotions are deep when they've been thrown into the deep end. Tony and Chris show up at Artie Bucco's restaurant with a pair of cruise tickets for the man and his wife, which is a short scene where Tony lies to Artie about the nature of procuring those tickets. A short scene of Tony missing his therapy appointment is in between this scene and the next, where Artie is telling his wife about it, and she is not having it. He rightfully wants a vacation, but his wife Charmaine doesn't want to accept a gift from Tony Soprano. She doesn't like that mobsters come in and spend money there, and is suspicious that by accepting the gift, they will inadvertently be associating themselves with the mob. She is not wrong, but because she doesn't have the full picture, she doesn't know that Tony is trying to protect them from the mob tomfoolery that he was unable to prevent. Phase 2 of the Mahaffey plan is simultaneously underway, with Mahaffey being generously convinced to falsify MRIs. Interestingly, he brings up being prescribed Zoloft, and the observation is made that a solution for his impulsive and compulsive gambling problem is found after it's gotten him into serious trouble. In the next scene, Tony takes his Prozac. The reason he's decided to skip his therapy appointments is because he notices his meds are working and thinks the Prozac is fixing everything. He's at work at the dump and is told the Kolar bros withdrew their bid, which is good news for them and means that what Chris and Big P pulled off worked. Artie is there to visit Tony and decline the tickets, and Tony is shocked but can't argue. Tony happens upon Melfi in the wild with her husband at the restaurant he frequents. He ends up getting she and her husband a table right away where they had been waiting and were about to leave before. This is where we learn that Tony is lying to Carmela about having stopped cheating on her. Tony then takes Carmela to the same restaurant where the waitstaff cover for him about how often he's been there by saying how long it's been. Tony tells her he's on Prozac and seeing a therapist, which happily surprises her when she thinks he's about to confess to another affair. She's all about being a better person, so she's genuinely happy. A noteworthy exchange in their banter is when he tells her she's the only person he's completely honest with, and she scoffs at him. This is another very layered moment because while on the surface that seems false, it's actually true. In his mind, honesty isn't telling her every wrongdoing that he perpetrates. His problem is that he thinks there are things she should know about and things she shouldn't know about, and uses that thought process to decide for her what to know. So while in a sense they're both right, they're also both wrong compared to the standard that they both seem to have. On one hand, it's advantageous for his job as a crime boss, and on the other, it's used time and time again to violate their marriage. To him, honesty is telling her things he knows he can't hide, and would embarrass or otherwise harm him if it got out. This confession by Tony opens up a heartfelt conversation between the two about how life works. Carmela supporting his feelings, and Tony encouraging her about the problems with Meadow. His experience watching his sisters with his mother helps him understand this aspect, and understand women in a way that helps him be able to give advice to both. We see that Chris informs Tony of Uncle Junior's target getting into town, and we see how the news reports the mob scene. They're aware of at least some of the members in the mob. By the 80s, newscasters were reporting on mob events pretty casually. This scene in itself is short, but can be taken in many ways as a signal to the end, as Tony describes at the beginning of this episode. This leads into Tony giving orders to Silvio Dante day at their kids' volleyball game. The problems of Uncle Junior's hit and the feud between Meadow and Carmela are effectively taken care of one right after another. Meadow is attempting to get her father's thoughts on the situation between she and her mother after she's disappointed her mom didn't come to her game. Carmela is making the mistake of treating her child like another adult. Just because they can start talking back to you does not make them suddenly grown. So even if Meadow is doing the whole silent treatment and crossing her arms, her mom being affected by that and withdrawing further from her child just reinforces the kid's belief that the parent doesn't love them. They start out having that idea and acting out on that feeling of sadness, but responding in a way that validates that emotion turns that thought into a reality for them. Tony looks up to see a church he hadn't been to in a while and is distracted. He enters, which is what Carmela was trying to get him to do in the first place. While Meadow is trying to talk to her father about the frustrations she has, trying to understand her mother's intentions and actions, while seeing if her father thinks that it's fair to be upset at Carmela, Tony is tripping out on the fact that his grandpa and great-uncle built the church. He gets his daughter to understand and be impressed by that fact, ultimately humbling her a bit. The irritation between Carmela and Meadow isn't mentioned again in this episode after this talk, but Tony handled the situation very well. He's not ignoring her, but he's not dropping everything to trash-talk Carmela with Meadow to make her feel better. He's taking her mind off of the subject for a while. As a parent, he is a good partner to Carmela because he supports her and lets her raise the children as she sees fit. He's not going to tell Meadow that she's right because that would mean telling her that deals are okay to welch on if you don't think the punishment is fair. In his line of work, that attitude gets you killed fast because it's childish and non-committal. It's exactly what he was saying he despised about the new mafia, where nobody is willing to take the prison time they knew they were risking. Meadow broke her curfew and she agreed to adhere to it, and since she agreed that the Aspen trip was the reward for the behavior she promised, her complaining about it not being fair is just her being the child she is and not understanding time or consequences. It's an important lesson to learn, and although Meadow was in the wrong, that doesn't mean Carmela can't work with her or attempt to find a compromise. Maybe neither of them thought that perhaps the curfew should be extended now that she's older, or have a list of exceptions. This was before cell phones were widely used though, so I think that nowadays it is easier to let your teenagers have a longer curfew. There are lots of ways that their fight could be worked with, but in this moment, Tony is doing a good job parenting because he's not alienating his child, nor allowing the child to run the house. Meadow has respect for her dad, but only because his attitude is compared to Carmela's perceived unfairness. In the last 10 minutes of the episode, Artie Bucco's restaurant is blown up by Silvio acting on the orders Tony gave him. Tony finally decides to show up to his therapy appointment to tell Melfi how well the pills are working and that's why he hasn't needed therapy. This is another common problem people have when taking meds like Prozac. When it's not explained or understood that the meds taking away the bad feelings is supposed to be a step in the healing and not the fix, people like Tony will make the mistake of thinking they're cured. They'll stop therapy or stop the medication not realizing that the medication helps you get past the bad feelings so they don't distract you from finding real solutions, or so you can start thinking rationally past the depression or anxiety. However, Melfi informs him that the medication hasn't had enough time to work yet. She explains that him finally going to therapy and being open has been the reason for his short-term fix in attitude, and that the two go hand in hand for long-term healing. Tony begins describing a wild dream to her in response, and this is the moment of breakthrough where Tony realizes he was projecting his feelings about his family onto the ducks. We discussed some of this in the first video, but as far as Tony describing it in his own words, he sounds as if a family is something he doesn't quite understand, but thinks is beautiful. This truly describes his feelings about his family in general. He endlessly tries to please his mother and uncle, and is more or less the type of father who enjoys watching his family do their thing and live their lives while he performs his duties. He doesn't stay involved in the family drama and tries to fix it where he can, but also internalizes it quite a bit. He recognizes Carmela for what she is and fell in love with her for those reasons, but the ways he should be showing appreciation and commitment for her conflict with the negative and ultimately false values he was raised with. And as we've discussed, Tony has a commitment problem even to himself, to where there must be an excuse for everything or it can be ignored until he's forced to deal with it. He's let himself be an autopilot without realizing it, and contributing to the cycles he grew up thinking were okay. He's not thinking about how to be a better person, because that means to stop being who he is in the moment. Accepting therapy as begrudgingly as he has is the start of Tony bettering himself and allowing his true positivity to shine through, instead of being the sad clown as he describes. The truth of Tony's nature is that he's a very sensitive person who was molded by the people around him who see sensitivity as a weakness. Tony feels shame in crying, and in the moment he says, now he's gonna cry, that says a lot about how he was treated growing up. Just off of that, it sounds like he would naturally cry a lot growing up and get his feelings hurt, and then would be mocked by the people, like his mom for sure, who hurt him. All Tony has wanted is a functional, loving family, and has never been allowed to comfortably think about how to provide that beyond financially. Tony is afraid he's going to lose his family, and the worst part of that fear and realization is not knowing how to spend time the best way with them. His actions are the things that drive his family away, and even if they weren't, naturally over time they will be lost to him, whether he outlives them or dies himself. One of the first ways to know you care about something is being afraid to lose it, and he's ready to really think about what it means to him to have created his own little family. That, combining with his ability to provide, the garbage business not earning him as much as it used to, Tony does not see himself as worth sticking around for if he's not making a lot of money. The entirety of the dream that leads up to his realization is interpreted as Tony being afraid of his impending irrelevance and death. He knows that his family will be fine without him, so much so that maybe they don't even need him now. The very thing he was born into directly conflicts with his ability to be a good husband and father, aside from being able to provide for them financially. So him dreaming that he is unscrewing his belly button says that he is seeing himself as the type of a machine or tool. His belly button, which is the result of his mother's umbilical cord, is robotic and cold. He's unscrewing it, which can be interpreted as the therapy he's receiving, making him explore his spiritual and mental self, which is directly connected to his mother. But as he finishes unscrewing it, his wiener falls off, which directly relates to his famous actor monologue. His perceived masculinity is neutered by him cutting off his toxic emotional ties to his mother through therapy. Still seeing himself as mechanical on autopilot, he is then looking for an old mechanic buddy of his to fix him. However, the duck that is supposed to be representative of his family, of his stolen youth, of who he really is as a man, whisks it away. He feels like while he's lost who he is, a part of himself lives on in his family, but through his own actions, he will never see it again. AJ, Anthony Jr., is turning 13, growing up, not a little kid anymore, and Tony has to deal with all the emotions that come with that. Tony and Carmela are alike in the way that they want their kids to live better lives than they did growing up, but weren't prepared for what that meant, and weren't prepared to partake in the communication that is required once basic needs are met and more complex conversation arises. So as AJ turns 13, there goes Tony's last chance of raising a baby. It's not a bad thing, but if he's not ready to move on, then he won't know how to continue raising the person AJ is becoming. At the makeup birthday party for AJ, Artie Bucco was talking about the destruction of his restaurant with Tony at the grill. The older members know how to handle Artie's stress because they were in control of the situation, and advise him to collect on the insurance. Christopher shows again how he doesn't get it, and with the indignity of youth, he tells Arthur off a bit by alluding to why it was necessary, then leaves. Tony and the guys try to BS Arthur some more and try to console him a bit, but the poor guy cries since he doesn't know what the hell anyone is even talking about anymore. Tony goes to talk to Christopher, and it's revealed that Chris feels unappreciated for his work, which is why he was triggered by the ungrateful attitude he perceived from Arthur, who again had no idea what was going on. Tony actually agrees with him and admits that's how he was raised, and it was a mistake. However, Chris mentions the dang Hollywood idea, which immediately throws Tony into a defensive, bad mood. Although Chris was upset at others being ungrateful to him, he does not understand how ungrateful and serious it would be if he sold out to Hollywood. He doesn't accept Tony's apology gracefully. He doesn't get that the money isn't the most important part of this equation, and doesn't get that the consequences of selling his story would result in deaths and jail time, potentially including his own. He doesn't seem to get that he's effectively saying, I could have killed you, instead of, I could have made millions. Telling Tony he had his life on the line for something as petty as a thank you definitely speaks to the layers of his entitlement. Tony blows up on him, but collects himself quickly, reminding himself that Christopher doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. He reassures Christopher that things will be fine, with an ironic what could be bad, because the next and final scene is between Uncle Junior and Tony's mother, who couldn't come to AJ's first party because Tony wanted her to drive herself instead of asking for a ride. While Tony refused to drive his mother to promote her health and probably to avoid being in a car alone with her, he made a mistake in just not doing what she asked, because Uncle Junior was probably the worst person she could have gotten a ride from, since they share and fuel each other's negativity. They both act like they despise Tony and believe he has negative intentions towards both of them, while doing exactly what Tony said about praising his deceased father. This scene really shows the reality of negativity, where two people are actively engaging in harmful and untrue rhetoric about another family member. Ironically, Uncle Junior feels the same way about Tony that Tony feels about Chris. A real case of that boy ain't right. Both Livia and Junior are very displeased with how things have changed and have sympathy for each other. It's not that they're wrong for feeling the way they do, but they're feeling that way about lies. Junior thinks Tony is meddling in his affairs to disrespect him, when Tony is actually trying to look out for everyone. Junior complains about Tony's perceived behavior as being generational. It's generational for older people to blame any generation younger than them for the problems they have, but there's lots of fear behind those statements. They are afraid of Tony in a way, both of them believing that he can't wait for them to die. The look Livia gets on her face when Junior mentions doing something about Tony is totally disturbed. But if something happened to Tony, then she would act the same way she does about Tony's father. She would use it in a long list of her sympathy vampire techniques. I believe people like that are addicted to the adrenaline or other chemical that being stressed or sad gives you. The world's bad side is a never-ending misery machine that gives depression junkies heavy doses daily, and Tony's mother is the type to try new experiences and learn new things just to have something else to whine about so she doesn't feel boring. The last line of the pilot is, "Hey Meadow, I'm not gonna eat, are you?" by Meadow's friend Hunter, who we know has a bad influence on her. As we know, Meadow is a lot like her father, and as such is heavily open to being influenced. Tony's entire way now was created through bad influences. It tells us as the viewer that while Tony may feel that his time is at an end, his children's time is barely beginning, and they are very susceptible. As the camera pans over to the pool, we're left thinking about family, an ending, but also the continuation. Hunter's words are almost like a cliffhanger for Meadow's journey. Thank you for waiting for this video and supporting me throughout it. I'm going to be uploading a short trivia video about the pilot episode of The Sopranos next, and then we'll continue on to Breaking Bad. Stay safe and have a good time until then. If you like to, subscribe, like, comment, have a good discussion, and keep your minds open.